Jake Morrison had calloused hands that could gentle the wildest Mustang, yet those same hands trembled as he held his newborn daughter for the first time. The tiny bundle in his arms seemed impossibly fragile compared to the rough world of cattle, drives, and frontier life he knew so well. His wife Sarah smiled weakly from their bed in the small cabin they'd built together on the outskirts of Dodge City, Kansas. "She's beautiful, Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the autumn wind, rattling their windows. Little Emma had Sarah's delicate features and the same golden hair that had first caught his eye at the church social 3 years ago. Their son Tommy. The boy had inherited his father's sturdy build and determination, already showing signs of the stubborn streak that ran through the Morrison men. Jake scooped Tommy up with his free arm, creating a picture of complete family happiness that would be in. He owned a modest spread and had built a reputation as one of the most reliable trail bosses in Kansas. Ranchers trusted him to get their herds to market safely, and he'd never lost a single head to rustlers or stampedes. His success had allowed him to provide Sarah with comforts many frontier wives could only dream of: real glass windows, Castillon stove shipped from back east, and even a piano that had cost him 3 months' wages. But Sarah had been acting strange lately, complaining of headaches and dizzy spells. The nearest doctor was in Dodge City, a hard day's ride away, and Jake had been planning to take her there after the baby was born. Now, looking at her pale face and the dark circles under her eyes, he wished he'd insisted on the trip sooner. Jake mentioned, settling into the chair beside their bed. "Good. Money, but I can wait until you're stronger." Sarah shook her head, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We need the money, Jake. Winter's coming, and with 2 children now." She didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood. Every dollar mattered on the frontier. Jake had met Sarah when she arrived in Dodge City as a schoolteacher. She'd been different from the saloon girls and shopkeepers. Daughters educated, refined, with dreams of bringing civilization to the wild frontier. Their courtship had been proper but passionate, conducted under the watchful eyes of the church ladies and her boarding house keeper. Their wedding had been the social event of the season, with Sarah wearing a dress ordered special from St. Louis, and Jake cleaned up in a borrowed suit that barely contained his broad shoulders. They'd honeymooned in their own cabin, which Jake had spent 6 months building with his own hands, planning every room with Sarah's comfort in mind. The first year of marriage had tested them both. Sarah struggled with the isolation and harsh conditions, missing the companionship of other educated women and the cultural activities she'd left behind. But love had conquered their differences, and by the time Tommy arrived, they'd found their rhythm as partners in the challenging business of frontier life. Now, watching Sarah cradle their daughter while Tommy played with his wooden horses on the floor, Jake felt a contentment he'd never known existed. A family of his own, a legacy to leave behind. Proof that a man could carve something good and lasting out of the unforgiving wilderness. The next morning brought troubling news. Sarah's fever had spiked during the night, and she was having difficulty nursing the baby. Jake's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an experienced midwife, examined Sarah with growing concern. Her whispered conversation with Jake in the kitchen left him pale and shaken. "Post-birth fever," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Sometimes the body just can't fight off the infection." Jake's world tilted on its axis. "What can we do?" The older woman's expression said everything her words couldn't. "Keep her comfortable. Pray. Send for the doctor, though I doubt he'll make it in time." Jake dispatched his fastest horse to Dodge City with a desperate message, but deep in his heart, he knew it was too late. Sarah was slipping away from him, and there wasn't a damn thing his strong hands or stubborn will could do to stop it. The woman who'd brought light and laughter into his hard life was fading like a candle in the wind, as the sun set on what might be their last day together. Jake sat beside Sarah's bed, holding her hand and telling her stories about the future he'd planned for their family. He spoke of taking the children to see the ocean, of building a bigger house, of watching Emma learn to play the piano her mother loved so much. Sarah smiled and nodded, though Jake wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. Outside their cabin, the autumn wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter ahead. All he knew was that he had to hold on to these precious moments for as long as possible, storing them up against the darkness that was coming. Sarah Morrison died on a Tuesday morning as the first snow began to fall. Jake held her hand as she took her last breath, her wedding ring cold against his palm. Little Emma cried in the cradle nearby, hungry and confused, while 2-year-old Tommy played quietly in the corner, sensing something terrible had happened, but not understanding what death meant. The funeral was small, but heartfelt. The whole community of Dodge City turned out, their respect for Jake evident in their solemn faces and gentle words. Sarah had taught many of their children to read and write, and her loss was felt by everyone who'd known her kind heart and gentle ways. They buried her in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town, with a simple wooden cross that Jake carved himself, after the last mourner left. Jake stood alone at the graveside with his children. Snow continued to fall, covering the fresh earth like a blanket. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered to the cross. Emma's cries from Mrs. Patterson's arms seemed to echo his own heartbreak. The next weeks passed in a blur of desperate attempts to care for 2 small children while managing his cattle business. Jake tried everything to feed baby Emma, but without a wet nurse, the child grew weaker each day. Tommy began waking with nightmares, calling for his mama in the dark hours before dawn. The house that had once been filled with Sarah's laughter and piano music became a place of endless crying and sleepless nights. Mrs. Patterson helped when she could, but she had her own family to care for. Other neighbors brought food and offered advice, but Jake could see the pity in their eyes. A single man trying to raise 2 babies on the frontier was a recipe for disaster, and everyone knew it. Several well-meaning women suggested he give the children to families who could care for them properly. But Jake's stubborn pride wouldn't allow it. The Jameson contract couldn't wait any longer. Winter was closing in fast, and if Jake didn't get their cattle to market soon, the herd would be stuck until spring. The money from this drive would keep his family fed through the winter, assuming he could find someone to care for his children. While he was gone, his sister Mary lived in St. Louis with her husband. Jake had always been too proud to accept charity, but now desperation forced his hand. He wrote a letter explaining his situation and begging Mary to come help, promising to pay her husband well for her time. While waiting for Mary's response, Jake struggled through each day. Emma was growing weaker despite his best efforts to feed her milk from their cow. Tommy had become clingy and difficult, following Jake everywhere and screaming whenever he left the room. The cattle business that had once seemed manageable now felt impossible with 2 small children underfoot. The letter from Mary arrived on a frozen morning in November. Jake's hand shook as he read her response. She would come immediately and stay as long as needed, asking nothing in return except to help her beloved brother through this terrible time. Relief flooded through Jake for the first time since Sarah's death. Mary arrived 3 days later on the afternoon stage, bringing with her a carpet bag full of baby clothes and a determination that reminded Jake of their mother. She was 5 years older than Jake, married but childless, and she fell in love with Tommy and Emma immediately. Within hours of her arrival, the house began to feel like a home again. Under Mary's care, both children began to thrive. Away with babies that seemed almost magical, and Emma finally began gaining weight. Tommy warmed to his aunt quickly, charmed by her stories and gentle discipline. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jake felt like he could breathe again. But Mary's presence was only temporary, and Jake knew it. Her husband's business needed her back in St. Louis, and she couldn't stay on the frontier indefinitely. Had to find a permanent solution, but every option seemed impossible. Orphanages were no place for babies, and Jake couldn't bear the thought of splitting up his family. "There's something you need to consider," Mary said one evening as they sat by the fire after the children were asleep. "Sarah's cousin Rose in Denver. You remember her from the wedding?" Jake nodded. Rose had been Sarah's favorite relative, a widow herself who'd moved west after her husband died in the war. "She's alone now, Jake, and she loves Sarah like a sister. I think she'd welcome the chance to help raise Sarah's children." The idea of sending his children away felt like tearing out his heart, but Jake was beginning to understand that love sometimes meant making impossible choices. Rose was a good woman, stable and kind, with the means to provide for Tommy and Emma properly. But she was also a stranger to his children, and the thought of them growing up without knowing their father made Jake's chest tighten with grief. Winter was closing in fast, and Jake had to make a decision. The Jameson cattle drive would be his last chance to earn money before spring, but it would take him away from his children for at least a month. Mary couldn't stay much longer, and every day he delayed made the situation worse. That night, Jake sat by Emma's cradle and made the hardest decision of his life. He would take the cattle drive, earn the money his family needed, and then decide what to do about the children. Maybe by spring, he'd have figured out a way to keep them with him. Maybe Rose would agree to come to Kansas instead of taking the children to Denver. Maybe some miracle would show him a path he couldn't see now. As snow continued to fall outside their warm cabin, Jake held his sleeping daughter and tried to memorize every detail of her tiny face. Tomorrow he would begin preparations for the cattle drive that might change everything. Tonight, he was still a father, still the head of a family, still fighting to hold on to the only things that mattered in his broken world. The cattle drive started on a bitter December morning with Jake leading 200 head of Jameson cattle toward the railhead in Abilene. The weather was already turning dangerous, with gray clouds promising more snow and temperatures dropping below freezing even at midday. Most trail bosses would have waited for spring, but the Jamesons needed the money. Jake needed it even more. His crew consisted of 6 experienced cowboys, all men he'd worked with before. They knew about his recent loss and treated him with respectful silence, understanding that this drive was about more than just moving cattle. For Jake, every mile they covered brought him closer to the financial security his children needed and further from the home where their mother had died. The first week went smoothly, despite the cold. The cattle moved well, and the men worked together efficiently, settling into the familiar rhythms of trail life. Jake found himself falling back into old habits, rising before dawn to check the herd, spending long hours in the saddle, sleeping, under stars that seemed unusually bright in the crystal-clear winter air. But at night, when the camp was quiet except for the sound of cattle settling and the occasional coyote call, Jake's thoughts turned to Tommy and Emma. Were they sleeping peacefully under Mary's care? Was Emma still growing stronger? Did Tommy ask for his papa? The questions tormented him, but he pushed them aside each morning and focused on the job at hand. On the 8th day, the weather turned vicious. A blue norther swept down from Canada, bringing with it temperatures that froze water in the canteens and turned the ground rock hard. The cattle bunched together for warmth, moving slowly and reluctantly. Jake's horse developed ice crystals in its mane, and the men wrapped their faces in scarves to protect against the biting wind. That afternoon, disaster struck without warning. A wolf pack, driven by hunger and the harsh weather, spooked the herd near a rocky outcropping. The cattle, already nervous from the cold, exploded into a full stampede. Jake and his men rode desperately to turn the herd, but the animals were beyond control. Thundering across the frozen prairie like a brown river of death, Jake's horse stumbled on the icy ground, throwing him hard against a boulder. Pain exploded through his chest as several ribs cracked, and his left arm hung useless at his side, but he managed to grab another horse and continue the chase, knowing that losing the herd would mean financial ruin for both the Jamesons and himself. By the time they regained control, nearly 50 head were missing, scattered across miles of rough country. 2 of Jake's men were injured, 1 seriously, and their supplies had been trampled or lost in the chaos. Worse yet, more snow was falling, threatening to make travel impossible. Jake made the hardest decision of his career. With winter closing in and his crew injured, they couldn't afford to spend days searching for the missing cattle. They would drive what remained of the herd to Abilene as quickly as possible, accepting the financial loss rather than risking the lives of his men. The remainder of the drive was a nightmare of endurance. Jake's ribs sent daggers of pain through his chest with every movement, but he couldn't show weakness in front of his crew. The cold was so intense that coffee froze in their cups, and the men took turns warming their hands over small fires they built from dried buffalo chips. On Christmas Eve, they finally reached the railroad yard in Abilene. The cattle buyers were surprised to see a herd arrive so late in the season, but they were willing to pay fair prices for the surviving animals. Jake's crew collected their wages and headed for the saloons and warm beds of the town. But Jake lingered at the telegraph office. The message he sent to Mary was brief. Drive complete. Coming home soon. How are children? Her reply came within hours. Emma very sick. Come quickly. Jake's blood turned to ice water. He'd left his dying wife to earn money for his family, and now his baby daughter might be following her mother. Without waiting for his own injuries to heal, he bought the fastest horse he could find and began the desperate ride home to Kansas. The journey back was a blur of pain and fear. Jake's broken ribs screamed with every mile, but he pushed himself, and his horse relentlessly. He changed mounts twice, paying premium prices for fresh animals, knowing that every hour might matter. The winter landscape that had seemed beautiful on the drive out now looked hostile and unforgiving. He reached Dodge City on New Year's Day, arriving at his cabin to find Dr. Henderson's buggy outside. Mary met him at the door, her face grave. With worry, "She's fighting, Jake," she whispered. "But it's been touch and go. The fever broke yesterday, but she's so weak." Jake stumbled to Emma's cradle, his heart breaking at the sight of his tiny daughter, pale and thin but breathing. Tommy ran to him, wrapping small arms around his legs. "Papa." Emma been sick, but Aunt Mary made her better. Dr. Henderson examined Jake's injuries while explaining Emma's condition. The baby would recover, he believed, but it would take weeks of careful nursing. Jake's ribs were healing crooked, but would mend with time. More concerning was the exhaustion and grief Jake carried, visible in every line of his face that night. As Jake sat watching over his sleeping children, Mary approached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Jake, you can't keep doing this. The children need stability, and you need to heal," Rose wrote again, offering to take them until you're back on your feet. Jake looked at his sister, seeing the wisdom in her words but feeling his heart rebel against the idea. These children were all he had left of Sarah, the only reason his life still had meaning. But watching Emma fight for breath had shown him the terrible truth: his children needed more than his love. They needed safety, stability, and care he couldn't provide while working the dangerous trails. The decision that would change all their lives forever was approaching fast, and Jake knew he was running out of time to find another way. Outside, the Kansas wind howled across the frozen prairie, carrying with it the promise of more challenges ahead. Jake Morrison made his decision on a cold February morning while watching Tommy try to feed oatmeal to baby Emma. The 3-year-old was being surprisingly gentle with his sister, but his small hands spilled more food than made it into her mouth. Emma, now 4 months old and finally healthy again, giggled at her brother's efforts, her blue eyes bright with innocent joy. The sight should have filled Jake with happiness, but instead it broke his heart. This was what his children deserved. Every day, laughter, play, and the simple pleasure of family meals. Instead, they'd spent the winter in a house shadowed by grief, cared for by a series of well-meaning neighbors, while their father struggled to keep food on the table. Mary had returned to St. Louis 3 weeks earlier, her own family needing her attention. Since then, Jake had managed alone, but barely. Mrs. Patterson still helped when she could, but she was getting older and had her own grandchildren to mind. The other neighbors were kind, but busy with their own lives. Jake was fighting a losing battle against loneliness and desperation. The letter from Rose had arrived the previous week, written in Sarah's careful script that Rose had taught her years ago. She'd heard about Sarah's death through mutual relatives and was heartbroken. More importantly, she was eager to help raise Sarah's children, offering them a real home in Denver with educational opportunities and stability. Jake couldn't provide on the frontier. Rose owned a successful boarding house in Denver, catering to respectable travelers and businessmen. She'd never had children of her own, having lost her husband in the Civil War before they could start a family. Taking in Tommy and Emma would fulfill a dream she'd long abandoned while giving the children advantages Jake's modest ranch could never offer. But the thought of giving up his children felt like dying all over again. They were his connection to Sarah, his reason for getting up each morning, his hope for the future. Without them, what was he? Just another broken-down cowboy with nothing to show for years of hard work and sacrifice. Yet watching Tommy struggle, with tasks too big for his small hands, seeing Emma's need for constant attention he couldn't always provide, Jake knew he was being selfish. Love meant wanting what was best for them, even if it destroyed him. He wrote to Rose that evening, his hands shaking as he formed the words that would separate his family. He would bring the children to Denver in the spring, after the weather cleared and travel became safer. Till then, he would spend every possible moment with them, storing up memories to last the rest of his life. Spring came early that year. With warm winds melting the snow by the middle of March, Jake used the time to teach Tommy everything he could about their family history, showing him daguerreotypes of Sarah and telling stories about their courtship and marriage. Tommy listened solemnly, as if he understood the importance of remembering. Emma was crawling now, pulling herself around the cabin with determined energy that reminded Jake of her mother's spirit. She babbled constantly, and Jake was certain her first word would be Mama, though Sarah would never hear it. The baby seemed to sense his sadness, often crawling to where he sat and pulling herself up to pat his face with tiny hands. The journey to Denver took 2 weeks. Traveling by stage and train with frequent stops to rest and tend the children, Jake had never been on a train before, and the experience might have been exciting under different circumstances. Tommy pressed his nose to the windows, fascinated by the changing landscape. While Emma slept peacefully in Jake's arms, Denver was bigger and more sophisticated than Jake had expected. The boarding house Rose owned sat on a tree-lined street in the respectable part of town, a 3-story building with proper sidewalks and gas streetlights. Rose herself was waiting on the front porch when their carriage arrived, and Jake was struck by how much she resembled Sarah, with the same golden hair and gentle smile. "Jake," she said simply, embracing him carefully, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Sarah was like a sister to me." Then she turned to the children with tears in her eyes. "And these must be Tommy and Emma. Oh, they look just like her." At the boarding house was comfortable and clean, with spacious rooms and good furniture. Rose had prepared a nursery on the 2nd floor, complete with toys, books, and everything the small children could need. Jake had never seen such luxury, and he knew immediately that his children would have opportunities here he could never provide. That evening, after the children were fed and bathed and put to bed in their new room, Jake and Rose sat in her parlor discussing the arrangements. She wanted nothing in return except the joy of raising Sarah's children. She understood that Jake would want to visit regularly and remain part of their lives. Everything was reasonable, generous, and heartbreaking. "They'll have the best schools," Rose explained. "Music lessons, proper clothes, everything Sarah would have wanted for them. And when they're older, if they choose to return to Kansas, I'll support that decision completely." Jake nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. This was the right choice, the only choice that made sense. But it felt like cutting out his own heart. He stayed for a week, helping the children adjust to their new home and establishing routines they could follow after he left. Tommy was fascinated by the city, with its busy streets and interesting sights. Emma seemed comfortable, with Rose accepting her care with the adaptability of infancy. On his last morning, Jake sat in the nursery watching his children sleep. Tommy had sprawled across his small bed, one arm flung over his head in a gesture that reminded Jake of Sarah. Emma slept curled in her crib, tiny fists pressed against her cheeks. "I'll come back to see you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure. They could hear him. "I'll write letters, and Aunt Rose will read them to you. And someday, when you're older, maybe you'll understand why Papa had to go away." The goodbye was easier than Jake had expected, perhaps because Tommy was too young to fully understand what was happening. Emma was already reaching for Rose, comfortable with the woman who would now be her mother in all but name. Jake kissed them both, shook Rose's hand formally, and walked away without looking back. The train carried him back toward Kansas and a life that would never again include the sound of children's laughter in his house. Jake stared out the window at the passing landscape and wondered if he would survive the loneliness that stretched ahead of him like an endless prairie. Jake Morrison returned to an empty house and an empty life. The cabin that had once rung with Sarah's piano music and children's laughter now echoed only with the sound of his boots on wooden floors and the ticking of the mantel clock Sarah had brought from her family home. He threw himself into work with desperate intensity, taking any cattle drive offered, no matter how dangerous or far from home. For 3 years, Jake lived like a ghost of his former self. He drove cattle from Texas to Montana, from Colorado to the railheads in Kansas. His reputation grew as a man who would take the jobs others refused, who pushed through weather and hostile territory with grim determination. Ranch owners respected his skill, but other cowboys whispered that Jake Morrison had a death wish. During long nights on the trail, Jake would pull out the letters Rose sent regularly from Denver. She wrote of Tommy's progress in school, how he loved books but still talked constantly about cowboys and horses. Emma was walking now, then talking, then singing little songs that reminded Rose heartbreakingly of Sarah. Rose's careful words painted pictures of children who were healthy, happy, and slowly forgetting their father. Jake wrote letters in return. Awkward attempts to maintain connection across the miles and years. He sent money when he could, small gifts bought in frontier towns, pressed flowers from places he'd been that he thought Sarah would have loved. But he could feel the distance growing with each exchange, his children becoming strangers who shared his name, but not his daily life. The loneliness ate at him like a cancer. Jake's neighbors in Dodge City invited him for meals and social gatherings, but he always found excuses to decline. Several respectable widows made it clear they would welcome his attention, but the thought of replacing Sarah felt like betrayal. He existed rather than lived, moving through each day without joy or hope. In the summer of 1878, everything changed with a single telegram. Rose was dead, killed in a carriage accident while returning from the market. Tommy, now 6, and Emma, 4, were alone in Denver with no one to care for them except Rose's elderly housekeeper, who had already written to the authorities about finding proper placement for the orphaned children. Jake's world tilted on its axis for the second time in 5 years. He abandoned a cattle drive mid-journey, paying his crew from his own pocket to finish the job while he caught the first train to Denver. The children he'd left 3 years ago were strangers now, but they were still his children, still Sarah's babies, still the only family he had left in the world. He found them in Rose's boarding house, confused and frightened, clinging to each other in the nursery that had been their haven. Tommy remembered him, but Emma hid behind her brother when Jake knelt to embrace them. These weren't the babies he'd kissed goodbye 3 years ago. Tommy had grown tall and serious, with Sarah's thoughtful eyes and Jake's stubborn chin. Emma was a miniature version of her mother, with golden curls and a smile that could break hearts. "Papa," Tommy said uncertainly. Rose said, "You live far away with the cows." Jake's throat closed with emotion. "I do, son. But I'm here now, and I'm going to take care of you and Emma from now on." The legal arrangements took weeks to complete. Rose had left her property to distant relatives who wanted nothing to do with 2 small children. The local authorities were initially reluctant to release the children to a father they'd never met, but Rose's letters documenting Jake's regular correspondence and support convinced them of his genuine interest in his children's welfare. During those weeks of waiting, Jake slowly got to know his children again. Tommy was bright and curious, full of questions about ranch life and cattle drives. He'd learned to read well and could write his own name in careful script. Emma was shy but sweet, with an infectious laugh that reminded Jake painfully of Sarah. She called him Papa hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as she remembered their bond. But Jake quickly realized how unprepared he was to be. A single father to 2 young children, Tommy and Emma were accustomed to city life, 2 regular meals and clean clothes and supervised play. They'd never seen a cow up close, had never ridden horses, had never experienced the isolation of frontier life. Taking them back to Kansas would be like asking them to live on another planet. More troubling was Jake's recognition of his own limitations. 3 years of solitary living had made him rough around the edges, comfortable with the harsh realities of trail life, but unpracticed in the gentle arts of child rearing. He could teach Tommy to ride and rope, but what about school lessons? He could protect Emma from physical dangers, but who would teach her the social graces Rose had been nurturing? The solution came from an unexpected source: Mrs. Catherine Bennett, a widow who owned the boarding house next to Rose's, approached Jake with a proposition that would change all their lives. She'd observed him with his children during their weeks in Denver, and had been impressed by his obvious love for them and his determination to do right by them. Catherine was 42 years old, a practical woman who'd been widowed young and had built a successful business through hard work and sound judgment. She'd never had children of her own, a source of quiet grief that had shaped her adult life. Now she saw an opportunity to help a struggling family while fulfilling her own long-suppressed maternal instincts. "I have a proposition, Mr. Morrison," she said during one of their evening conversations while the children played in the garden. "You need someone to help care for those children, and I find myself at loose ends with Rose gone. Would you consider allowing me to return to Kansas? With you as their governess, I could teach them, keep house, help you manage the daily tasks of raising 2 young children." Jake stared at her in amazement. Catherine Bennett was an attractive, accomplished woman with her own successful business. Why would she give that up to help a struggling cowboy raise his children? But as she explained her situation, Jake began to understand. She was lonely too, tired of the endless routine of running a boarding house for strangers, hungry for the satisfaction of making a real difference in someone's life. The arrangement she proposed was strictly business. She would receive a salary, her own room, and the authority to make decisions about the children's education and daily care. In return, Jake would provide transportation back to Kansas and a chance for Catherine to create the family life she'd always wanted but never achieved. It was an unconventional solution, one that would certainly raise eyebrows and conservative. Dodge City. But as Jake watched Catherine patiently helping Emma with her letters, while Tommy peppered her with questions about everything from geography to arithmetic, he knew this woman could give his children what he couldn't: stability, education, and the gentle feminine influence every child needed. The journey back to Kansas was a revelation for Jake Morrison. Watching Catherine Bennett with his children, he saw glimpses of the family life he'd dreamed of but never quite achieved. Even with Sarah, Catherine had a natural way with Tommy and Emma, answering their endless questions with patience while maintaining the gentle authority that kept them well behaved during the long train ride. Tommy was fascinated by everything he saw through the train windows, and Catherine turned each sight into a geography lesson. When Emma grew fussy, Catherine produced books and games from her seemingly endless supply of traveling entertainment. Jake found himself relaxing for the first time in years, watching his children laugh and learn under Catherine's careful guidance. The townspeople of Dodge City were indeed curious about Jake's new household arrangement. A widowed cowboy returning with his children and an unmarried female governess raised eyebrows and set tongues wagging. But Catherine's dignified bearing and obvious devotion to the children quickly won over even the most skeptical church ladies. Mrs. Patterson, who'd helped Jake during those desperate early days, pronounced Catherine a sensible woman with a good heart, which was as close to a blessing as anyone could expect. The old cabin felt like a new home with Catherine's presence. Boxes of books and educational materials she'd brought from Denver, transforming the front room into a proper schoolroom. She hung cheerful curtains, arranged furniture to create cozy reading nooks, and somehow made the rough frontier dwelling feel civilized without losing its character. Tommy adapted to ranch life with enthusiasm that reminded Jake of his own boyhood. Within weeks, he was following Jake around the property, learning to care for horses and helping with simple chores. His city clothes gave way to practical ranch wear, and his pale complexion darkened to a healthy tan. But thanks to Catherine's influence, he continued his studies, reading voraciously and practicing his writing each evening after the day's work was done. Emma proved more challenging to settle. At 4, she had vague memories of her early life on the ranch, but was accustomed to the structured environment of Rose's boarding house. She cried for her Aunt Rose, missed the other children she'd played with in Denver, and was frightened by the vastness of the prairie that surrounded their home. But Catherine's patient love and Jake's gentle attention gradually won her over. The breakthrough came when Catherine suggested they create a garden behind the cabin. Emma threw herself into the project with surprising enthusiasm, carefully planting seeds and tending tiny shoots with the same devotion she'd once given to her dolls. The garden became her special domain, a place where she felt in control and productive. When the first vegetables appeared, her pride was infectious. She insisted on serving them at every meal. As months passed, Jake noticed changes in himself as well. Catherine's presence brought stability and routine to their household, but more than that, it brought hope. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jake found himself thinking about the future instead of just surviving each day. He began making improvements to the ranch, building a proper barn, and expanding the house to give everyone more space. The children thrived under Catherine's care and education. Tommy learned to read at a level that impressed even the traveling preacher who visited monthly. Emma's natural artistic talents emerged under Catherine's encouragement, and she spent hours drawing pictures of horses, flowers, and family scenes that covered the walls of their home like cheerful wallpaper. But it was the gradual growth of affection between Jake and Catherine that truly transformed their lives. What had begun as a practical business arrangement slowly evolved into something deeper. Jake found himself looking forward to their evening conversations after the children were asleep, when they would sit by the fire discussing books, sharing stories of their pasts, planning for their future. Catherine had never experienced the simple pleasures of family life that Jake took for granted. She delighted in Tommy's eager questions about everything from cloud formations to why grass grew green. She treasured Emma's spontaneous hugs and the trust both children showed in bringing their small problems to her for solutions. For a woman who'd spent years caring for strangers in a boarding house, being truly needed by people she loved was a revelation. The proposal, when it finally came, was typically practical and thoroughly discussed. They were sitting on the front porch one summer evening, watching Tommy teach Emma to skip stones in the creek, when Jake brought up the subject they'd both been thinking about for months. "Catherine," he said carefully, "we make a good team, don't we? With the children, I mean, and running this place?" She smiled, understanding where this conversation was heading. "We do indeed, Jake. Better than I ever imagined when I first suggested this arrangement. The thing is," Jake continued, his weathered hands nervous on his coffee cup, "the children need stability. They need to know their family won't be torn apart again. And honestly, I can't imagine this place without you anymore." Catherine's response was everything Jake had hoped for and more. "I've been thinking the same thing. These children have become mine in every way that matters, and you've become ... well, more than an employer, much more." Their wedding was small but joyful, held in the parlor of their expanded cabin with the whole community of Dodge City in attendance. Tommy, now 7, served as ring bearer with solemn pride, while 5-year-old Emma scattered flower petals from her beloved garden with dramatic flair that made everyone smile. Jake stood at the altar, watching Catherine approach in a simple but elegant dress she'd sewn herself, and felt Sarah's presence like a gentle blessing. He knew his first wife would approve of this woman who'd saved his children and given them all a second chance at happiness. Catherine wasn't replacing Sarah, no one could do that. But she was creating something new and wonderful from the ashes of tragedy as they exchanged vows. Jake promised to love and protect Catherine with the same devotion he'd shown Sarah, while Catherine promised to love Jake's children as if they were born to her. Tommy and Emma stood beside them, beaming with the satisfaction of children who knew their family was finally complete and secure. Years later, when Tommy had grown into a successful rancher and Emma had become a teacher like her stepmother, they would tell their own children the story of how tragedy had brought their family together. They spoke of their birth mother Sarah with love and respect, crediting her with giving them life and their father's devotion. But they spoke of Catherine with equal affection, honoring the woman who'd given them the gift of a stable, loving home when they needed it most. Jake Morrison had lost his first family to the harsh realities of frontier life, but through Catherine's love and sacrifice, he'd found his way back to happiness. The cowboy who'd once faced each day with grim endurance now woke each morning grateful for the second chance he'd been given to build something lasting and good from the raw materials of love, determination, and hope.